I wonder how many of us can pinpoint a moment in time that changed our lives. A single instant, an hour or a day. In today's Speaking of Suicide, we're going to hear a story of being reborn, of how a suicide attempt helped restart a new life and draw to a close an earlier life riddled with addiction and abuse. From the dark comes hope. The day is the 17th of April 2005. The then Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, had just married the now Queen Camilla. Tony Blair was about to become Prime Minister, while in the charts, Tony Christie and Peter Kay were looking for the way to Amarillo. What were you doing? Tom van den Hurk was just 2 weeks shy of his 17th birthday and living in Germany. And as he sobered up from the events of the day, it is the day he realised he was meant to be alive. Now, just before we hear from Tom, a reminder that Speaking of Suicide covers some pretty difficult territory. The conversations are open and honest. And if you need help and support, or listening to this is difficult, just press pause and get in touch with Mikey's line, and you'll find all their details in the show notes. I'm Dan Holland. Tom, I know the exact details of that day are difficult, and you don't want to talk about them, but can you start to describe for us the aftermath of the day? How did you come to realise that this was the start of a new lease of life for you?
It happened immediately after the act. During the act, I was highly intoxicated. But as soon as I came round from that high, the first thought, I remember this really clearly, that went through my head was, it was not meant to be. And I'm not a religious person, perhaps a little bit spiritual, but there was something that was telling me that some sort of higher power, or maybe some fate that is laid out, for us, told me that you have to continue. This is not the end of your story yet. You are still needed here on this planet, in this life.
How did those sort of feelings or thoughts come to you? Can you describe that?
It was an overwhelming sensation, an overwhelmingly positive sensation I felt through my entire body. It was actually a wonderful feeling. Although I had been through something so negative and so traumatic, I felt quite warm and fuzzy at the thought that there was something positive waiting for me. And maybe that was a coping mechanism at the time. But I think as I went through life, that feeling stayed with me through really, really difficult situations. And whenever I feel that life is really not going the way that I want it to go, I always recount that moment, how I felt then, and that feeling just carries me through life, even now, so many years later.
How did life start to improve for you then, as this realisation that you were meant to be alive after the event? How did life start to change for you after April 2005?
My entire focus shifted from the negative to the positive. I think before the act, I was consumed by pain, I would say, by the idea of not wanting to exist any longer. Maybe I was a little bit afraid of death, but I thought that not being there at all, being in a state of complete painlessness, that was my ultimate goal. That's all that I wanted. But now after the act, I felt completely differently. So my focus shifted towards all the things I really enjoyed in life. For me, that was a lot of artistic things. I joined a theatre group, for example, and I put all my energy into this group, and I met all these new wonderful creative people. And I couldn't even, just maybe a year later, I couldn't even fathom that a year ago I would have been in a place where I didn't want to exist any longer. Whereas now I was in a place where I was really, enjoying life, embracing life. And I was a teenager. I really wanted to experience everything. Everything was new, as people know when they are teenagers. Everything was exciting. And I don't think I had excitement before then at all. And now, all of a sudden, I was like, yeah, let's live, you know.
To help us understand how much of a transformation this was for you in life, how much of a dramatic change it was, can you take us back only to where you want to go, to your childhood, and just talk us through what took you to that point in April? You talked about the dark was disappearing and you had come into the light. Can you describe that dark?
I was raised by parents who were both very abusive. My mother in a very, very cruel and sadistic way. So home for me was never a safe space. Home was a place of terror. I cannot remember a single moment where I was at home as a child and enjoyed being there, feeling safe and comforted. That just did not exist. And I was very, very fortunate in a way that I had very loving grandparents, and I spent a lot of my time with my grandparents and my great-grandmother as well. So I wasn't always with my parents. Otherwise, I don't think I would be a sane person today. When I was a teenager, I really started to struggle because I started to understand whatever was happening to me was completely wrong. It was completely out of the ordinary. Other people, other parents did not behave like that at all. And I started to run away from home, so I slept rough. I consumed an enormous amount of alcohol, drugs as well, from a very young age, from 14, 15 years onwards. But I always still went to school. I always felt that education was something that could change my life. Although it was so dark, I always thought there was a spark of hope that maybe one day, things are going to change. And when I'm an adult, I'll do something with my life. But in order to get there, I need to go to school and I need to get a really good education. So I was at school completely drunk or on drugs or whatever. But I was there, I slept rough at night time. But in the morning, I would take the bus and I would go to school still. So that's the thing that carried me through. So although it was so dark, I have to say there was always that little spark of hope for me.
If you were coming into school having been drinking or on drugs and sleeping rough, were the school aware of that? Were your teachers aware of it? Did they offer support? Was there anyone you could go to?
No, there wasn't really much support at all. There was a school psychologist who I was referred to, but I think that was after the event, after I tried to take my own life and after I was in psychiatric care. And she was very helpful, but I think that help would have been needed earlier on. But it was just something that people were not aware of. Always been very, very good at hiding things, coming across as, perfectly, well put together and perfectly normal, if you want to use that word, and healthy. But yeah, inside I was not at all.
It sounds like it was probably a very frightening period of life for you in the family home.
Yeah, fear was the norm. I didn't know anything else unless I was somewhere else, unless I was in a safe space like, my grandparents' house, nursery, school even was a safe place for me because that terror did not exist there.
When I think back to my teenage years, there are times when, as a teenager, it can be an incredibly isolating period of your life. It can be lonely as well. And that's for teenagers who live what you might call a normal life or upbringing. But when I think back to my years as a teenager, there were times where I struggled to find a role model in life, and I found that quite hard because I didn't have a sort of a guiding light to help steer me sometimes. Did you have a role model you could look up to? And if so, how did they help? But if not, how did that affect you?
There were two stories, I suppose. Growing up in Germany, every child grows up on fairy tales. And I know that's not really the culture in the UK, but in Germany I can't overstate how important fairy tales are. And there's always the character of the evil mother or stepmother in fairy tales. And as I went through my childhood, I always knew that my mother was this evil character there. And for some reason, I think that got me through the abuse. The idea of living in this story, in the end, there was always there was always a happy ending, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And I think that got me through. So that wasn't so much as a role model, but it was more like a putting my life into context, if you wish.
How long did this period of sleeping rough and going to school, the drinking, the drugs, how long did that all go on for? Because you were incredibly young, as we said earlier on, when everything culminated.
About 2 years. Yeah, it was an incredibly painful period. There was no stability in my life whatsoever. I did anything I could to run away from home. I would be hiding sometimes with my great-grandmother for months. That was difficult for her. She was a lady in her 80s at the time. You know, she was living with a teenager who was drinking, who was taking drugs. That was incredibly challenging for her as well. Sometimes I would be hiding with my grandparents, sometimes sleeping rough in the street. For about 2 years that went on.
They sound like they were giving you safety and love and care when you needed it.
Yes, absolutely, yes. I don't think I would have got through it without that, yeah.
You said earlier on when you came out of psychiatric care, can you describe what that was like for a young person? Because I think some people might have stereotypical images of it or preconceived conceptions of it. But for a young person, did that give you, or what did that give you, that stability and that care?
It might sound very surprising to listeners, but for me that was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because what it gave me was stability. And that was the first time I felt completely safe in a place. I had a very, very structured day. That was very good for me. I had professionals I could talk to about all the things that happened to me and that were happening still at the time. That was very, very helpful. I trusted these people. They were very kind to me. They gave me professional help and advice. What was challenging was coming out of it. It was going back to school after, I think it was about 3 months I was there, because people obviously noticed I had been gone. And especially back in the early noughties, there was still so much stigma attached to that, more so even than today. And I did not feel comfortable sharing with all of my school peers where I had been or why I was there. But what was even worse was when I returned, I instantly realized that people had been talking. And it wasn't so much the other young people, it was more adults, it was teachers, it was even the caretaker. Everybody seemed to know. How they knew, I don't know. But everybody seemed to know, and I felt so utterly ashamed. And what was worse was that nobody addressed it honestly and openly. It was all gossip, so that made me feel really, really uncomfortable.
Did that come from a place of mischief, do you think, or did that come from a place of their own fears in not knowing how to talk to you or how you might be? Because I would like to hope that today, the fact that we can sit and have this conversation, the world is changing, and slowly, there's still a long way to go, we're starting to find conversations about our mental health and suicide. Not easy, I don't think they will ever be easy, but we're able to have them, which is a start. Do you think, what was going through their minds, do you think?
I think they saw me as the troublemaker. I was different from everyone else. Especially, I think, in the German psyche, we're still a country where people have to fit in. It's less individualistic than the UK, for example. You have to behave a certain way that is expected of you. You're part of a wider group. And if you fall out of that norm, you are the troublemaker. And I think I was seen that way. There was something not quite right with me. And I think it was was it mischief, I suppose, yeah. They were probably also really uncomfortable thinking about what happened to me could obviously happen to maybe their own children, Yeah, it was a very comfortable moment in my life.
Talk me through how things started to improve. What changed?
I think with time, people saw that I had changed quite a lot, and they probably forgot what had happened to me, and they just saw a new version of myself, and I became a high achiever for the first time, because now I was in a really good place. I could actually focus on so many things, and still to this day I'm like in awe at what I achieved simultaneously in my last years of high school. You know, I went to a very demanding school, and I went through all of that. I got good grades. As I said, I focused a lot on theatre. I got the main part. I had so many lines to learn. You know, that was an achievement. I got my driving lessons, and I got the license at the same time. I prepared moving to Scotland, where I still am to this day. There were so many things, and I just flew through them because I had all this positive energy, and life just seemed to be easy, I think, for the first time. And people saw that new Tom and the way he was almost seemingly flying through life. And I must have been probably a person that a lot of people wanted to be around with, because I was quite positive, you know, a very different person from who I was before.
And what about those close to you, your grandparents? How did they respond? Because they must have seen this rebirth of their grandson as quite remarkable.
They were incredibly proud of me, and they were incredibly supportive. They let me get away with things that I think other, you know, guardians would have never let their children get away with. For example, I was obsessed with going to San Francisco. I don't know where I got this idea from, but I really wanted to visit San Francisco. And I had a wee job. I was working as well, so I had a job in a cafe, and I saved up. And I was 17, you know, I was not even 18 yet. And I said to my grandparents, I want to go to San Francisco. And they gave me some money towards it as well, and they allowed me at 17 to go to San Francisco all by myself. I don't even think that's legal, but I went. And thinking back now, I was like, how on earth would you let a 17-year-old travel to the US for 10 days by himself? But they had so much faith and confidence in me, and I actually think it was the right thing. That's what I really, really needed. I needed to, you know, go out and see the world, and the world was so much bigger than that small world that I had inhabited for such a long period of time. And they were so supportive of that. It was wonderful, yeah.
Were you able to talk to them with time about your experiences as a young teen, and what you were thinking and what you were feeling?
No, it was very difficult, I think. Suicide was something that I couldn't really mention in my family, because my great-grandfather had taken his own life, and that was highly traumatic for the family, especially my grandmother. That was her dad. And I think even years and years later, you know, when I went through this myself, it would have re-scratched open so many wounds.
Yeah.
And I'd never felt comfortable talking about it. It was this massive taboo in our family. It's intergenerational trauma.
When your grandparents gave you this freedom to go to San Francisco and travel like you did, as you were describing that to me, you were smiling.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe to me what that sense of freedom and that sense of the world opening up for you from that small place it was felt like?
I don't think I've ever experienced anything like it ever again in my life. It was just so amazing. I remember I was on the underground, and I came from the airport, and I had to get off at Powell Street, I think, and you come out of the underground, and the first thing I saw was a cable car. I was just beaming. I was like I had arrived on another planet. I felt like, you know, Neil Armstrong entering the moon, because I had visited this place so many times, you know, in my mind, and there I was in reality, and I just felt absolutely invincible in this moment in time.
Now, some of you might recognise Tom's name and voice, because he's been on the podcast before, back in an episode called Sharing Stories of Survival. It's episode 42 if you want to scroll back and go and find it. And he was with his friend David Barber. Tom, you're a filmmaker and a teacher. You made a film called A Little While Longer, which is the story of 3 men sharing their own stories of surviving suicide. And I remember when we sat down to talk about the film with David, I asked you about the film, but you started with a confession. And you told David and me about this time in your life and your own suicide attempt. I hadn't met you before, but David knew you. And he was really quite taken aback by all of that, by your openness and your honesty. Not in a bad way, but it was I think we know why you shut it all away and you weren't opening up in the past. But why at that point did you feel you could open up and talk to David about it, or tell David about it?
Before making the film, I felt so uncomfortable talking about it because I realised later on, while making the film, that I carried so much stigma within me myself, and that I probably thought addressing suicide in public, having gone through that is just not the right thing to do. You know, this is what people do who are looking for attention, and that sounds so awful, but I really want to be honest with people because I think people can understand how much stigma we still have as a society, and I was so shocked to see this in myself. And when I made the film with these 3 really, really brave men, all of a sudden I realised that it was the right thing to do, to open up, because these men, I perceived them as so brave and almost powerful in a sense, because that horrible thing that happened to them, they were not afraid, they didn't shy away from it. And maybe there was part of me that wanted to be a bit like them, to have the same bravery and be more honest about it. And they got so much out of talking to each other about it, you know, they felt so much better by doing it. And I thought, no, I have to be honest now as well. I don't want to lock this away any longer, because I've been through exactly the same thing as them, and you know, I want to take that brave step too and open up about it. And since I've done that, I've just felt so much better, and I feel like it helped the healing process a lot.
What made you want to make the film in the first place? If you weren't comfortable at that point about opening up about your own suicide attempt, but you were comfortable about trying, there was clearly a story you felt important to tell, wasn't there?
I think there are 2 reasons. There's probably an official reason, and then there's a private reason that I perhaps didn't realise until later on. The official reason is because during the pandemic, my colleague Isa and myself, we became aware of so many suicides happening. But for us, the pandemic was also a time of, it was a celebration of life, because every time we were allowed to come together to go outside, we really celebrated living. And to us, that was a huge shock to see that people were in a space where they were not able to celebrate life the way that we were. And we couldn't believe it. We were so euphoric being outside in 2020, with seeing the sun, seeing the world, seeing other people. And that really fascinated us. But then I think the other reason is probably because there was part of me that wanted to talk about my own experience, that I had locked away for such a long time. But I did not realise that until making the film.
How did that moment of opening up, because it was in early 2024 we spoke with David, how did that moment of opening up help any longer term healing for you, change your mindset about being open and honest about your mental health? Once you'd kind of opened the door a little bit, how did it keep on changing?
It was for the first time in my life I could actually talk to people about it. There was a situation with a colleague of mine who I don't know that well recently, and I started telling a story, and I realised that my own suicide attempt would have been important for her to understand the story. And I paused for a second and I thought, should I be mentioning this? No, this is way too private. And I thought, do you know what? I said to her, I'm sorry, I give you some information which is very private now, but I don't mind sharing it with you. I said, I once tried to take my own life. And then I moved on. And it was so liberating just to be able to mention it, because it's a huge part of my life that I had to hide for such a long time. And now I don't have to do this any longer. And I find myself now discussing it with family members. With my sister recently, I talked about it for the very, very first time. And it's such a positive feeling to be able to process it, to go through it, to see other people's perspective and opinions about it. And it's it was really remarkable.
I think there's great strength in being able to expose our vulnerabilities. What strength or what do you get from being able to talk about it now, openly and honestly, and have that frank conversation with your sister, which sounds like it was probably a life-changing conversation too.
Yeah, it just makes me feel more rounded as a human being. It makes me feel more honest. I don't have to pretend that I'm this unscarred human being. I am not, but nobody is, we all carry some scars, whatever. And now I can actually reveal the person that I really am, and that's really, really wonderful.
And how does that help shape you today, this week, this month, and into the future? What do you draw on to be Tom today from that experience?
I think what I carry through life is pride now of my achievements. I like myself now as a person. When I wanted to die or not exist, I think I detested myself. I had so much self-hatred because I felt like I wasn't the person that, could be loved, deserved to be loved. And now I'm the complete opposite. Now actually I like myself. I'm an imperfect person and I like that. Perfect is boring, nobody wants to be perfect. And I'm happy with myself the way I am. That's good. That's a nice feeling, yeah.
Good. And an honest person as well, I suspect.
Yes. And I see my flaws and stuff, and that's totally fine. We all have them. But yeah, that makes me me, It's part of my experience.
Tom, I think it takes great courage to be as open and honest as you have today, all with a view to trying to remove stigma and look forward in life and celebrate life you have today, and not feel alone going through that. So thank you very much indeed for sharing your story today and being so honest with me.
You're very welcome.
Here's Shona from Mikey's Line with a few thoughts to take away from our conversation today.
Yeah, the thing that I'm taking away from listening to Tom there is it's like he had intergenerational trauma and a horrific childhood, and understandably that led to a part of him not wanting to live anymore, and then this second chance, this second life. But where I want to pick up on and reflect on is another second chance. So he already had rebuilt his life and had a successful life. But while making this film about suicide, he realised he still had internalised the stigma around suicide and was keeping part of him still locked away. And by witnessing these three courageous men in the film that he made, it spoke to this part he had locked away, and he wanted some of their courage and caught it. And then very gently, very tenderly shared his story with a friend who was struggling. And I really love this idea of not rushing. We don't always have internal permission to do something. So doing it gently and slowly first. And then that seemed to have gone well. I think it was very helpful for his friend to hear his story. And it sounds like he's now shared his story more. And here he is further breaking the stigma by sharing his story on the podcast. So yeah, I just love this idea. Just as stigma is socially learned, so too is courage. And yeah, through the telling of our stories and talking about our mental health, talking about stigma or difficulties or experiences we've had with suicide, we are all beginning to change that conversation and giving others courage. So thank you so much, Tom. Yeah, really appreciate listening to you.
A huge thanks to Shona and all the team at Mikey's Line for the work they do. And don't forget, if you need someone to talk to or some help, then you can text Mikey's Line on 07786 207755. That's 07786 207755. Or you can contact them via Messenger, web chat and WhatsApp. And the number for WhatsApp is 01463 729 000. Or you can go and visit them at the Hive, 4 Struthers Lane in Inverness. They're open 7 days a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. and all those details and the links are in the show notes. This episode of Speaking of Suicide was sponsored by McDonald's in the community, and the platform is sponsored by Highland-based family firm D&D Paving. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Speaking of Suicide is produced by Adventurous Audio Limited.